Americans love baseball, especially white Americans, but during that time period they only like to see white players. I'm sure you all heard of the Negro League. It was very popular and famous during that time, but I bet you didn't know that there was a Japanese American League as well. It was called the Nisei League, and it was made up predominantly of teams in the West Coast. I started out for the Wapato Nippon team in Washington State before making my way to the pride of Little Tokyo, the LA Nippons. See, back in the 1930s, I was pretty well known in baseball circles as a pitcher and a hitter. The LA Nippons also were part of a Los Angeles County league where we played against merchant teams and semi-pro teams like the Tom Mix Wildcats. Paramount Studios had a team, the Hollywood Athletic Club. The LA Nippons and I even took our talents over to Japan, where we played in 25 games. We won 20 of them against college teams and amateur teams because during that time period in Japan, it was considered dishonorable to take money for playing a sport. But that changed once USA sent over their MLB All-Star League team, and that was made up of Babe Ruth, Lefty O'Doul's, Lou Gehrig, and they beat the Japanese All-Star team in every contest they played. But after that, the guy who started that tour, he kept that Japanese All-Star team together, and that was part of the beginning of professional baseball in Japan. You see, all the baseball I did in LA was considered semi-pro, but I finally turned pro in 1936, when me, other Oriental players, and a few white Americans went back to Japan to help start the league over there. I played in Nagoya, Japan, and along with the Hanshin Tigers, the Yomiuri Giants, and a few other teams, we had enough to start up our own league over there. See, they brought us Americans over because, well, we knew how to play baseball. Maybe you'll recognize some of my other teammates. Jimmy Bona, Kiyomi Slim Hirakawa, Fumito Jimmy Horio, Andrew Harris Garland, Yoshio Takahashi, Tadashi Wakabayashi, Herbert Buster North. Maybe you don't know those names, but we were a nice mix of Oriental and white American players. However, around 1939, all the American players had to move back home because the war drums began. I moved back under different circumstances. See, around that time was when I married my beautiful wife, Melba. Melba was half white, half Japanese. Her father was a Japanese immigrant who came to America in 1894. His name was Tokumatsu Yomimaru, and he graduated from Yale University. He was a famous art dealer specializing in Asian art and artifacts. Her mom was of German descent. She left the family when she was at Melba's very young age, and Melba grew up with her father, her grandmother, and aunt on her mom's side, and they lived together. They still live together today in this building over here, where I live. Melba came over to Nagoya, Japan, and we got married there at the U.S. Vice Chancellor's office. From then, we relocated to the West Adams area where we settled and all lived together. It was my father-in-law, his grandmother and sister-in-law of German descent, me, Melba, and our son Wally. Wally was my adopted son from Melba's previous marriage. She had married a traditional Japanese family, but things didn't work out, and I had met her after her divorce. Anyway, tragedy struck the country December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. We were shocked just like everyone else, and we had nothing to do with it, of course, but that didn't really matter. A few months later, President Roosevelt signed an executive order granting the military the right to establish military zones at their own discretion and to exclude Japanese Americans. Exclude was the word they used for relocating Japanese Americans from their homes in the West Coast. We were considered enemy aliens, myself, Melba, and our son Wally, even though we had been born in America. So, without much discussion, we were forced to relocate. First at the Santa Anita Assembly area, also known as the Santa Anita racetracks. Overnight, the West Adams Jefferson Park area turned into a ghost town. First, actually, we were told to meet at the Japanese Methodist Church over on Normandy and 37th Street, and from then we were bused over to Santa Anita. So it was me, my father-in-law, and Melba and our son Wally. Melba's grandmother and aunt were forced to leave because of their German ancestry. They were allowed to stay in the house, which was lucky for us because we didn't have to sell all of our possessions. Other Japanese Americans weren't so fortunate. My sister, brother, father, and mother, they had rented a house over on Hobart and Olympic, and they were forced to quickly sell all of their furniture. So, without much time, they had to do that, and they sold the refrigerator for $5, which was very, very discounted rate, even in 1942. So, going over to Santa Anita Assembly area, all we were allowed were a suitcase full of clothes. We had to sew our money into our clothes so that it wasn't stolen because there were no banks in internment camps. We lived over in Santa Anita Assembly area for several months. It was Army-style living over there. There were mess halls, latrines, we showered in horses' stables. We lived in barracks that were split into 6 different sections, and all the space we had were for 4 Army cots, a small table in the middle, and a little nightstand. Me and Melville lived there for longer than most people, as I was working in administration and she was in the dental department. But afterwards, we were shipped over to Amanchi, Colorado, where there was permanent housing and relocation for Japanese Americans until the end of the war. I was able to get out of the internment camp in 1943 by enlisting into the service. I was trained to read, write, and speak Japanese as I was being trained to become a prison interrogator. I spent 9 months in Minnesota in intensive training before I was shipped off to war. My brother, who had lost everything, he was one of the Japanese Americans who protested our relocation, and for that he was sentenced to prison in Leavenworth. After the war, he was pardoned. My father-in-law, Mr. Yomimura, was born in Japan. He had felt that Japanese Americans should not have been imprisoned or relocated, but he did not protest so that he could take care of Melba and our son while I was in the service. They were actually allowed to leave the internment camp just before the war ended and return back to West Adams, but because Mr. Yomimura was born in Japan and Orientals at that time were not allowed to become citizens, he was not allowed back into California or live in Washington or Oregon for that matter, so he had to move to Chicago. He passed away in 1945. Before I returned, my family was able to keep the house up. We were required to sell a few things, my beloved Buick, my old Ford. We had to borrow money from our life insurance, but life insurance companies lowered our payments, which made things more bearable for my family. After I returned back to Los Angeles, my life was pretty much uneventful. I held a variety of jobs. My son grew up and he became a police officer. I lived in the same house for the rest of my life over in West Adams, and my son still lives there today, which is pretty rare in Los Angeles, I guess. Many Japanese Americans had to work very, very hard to recoup the losses they suffered during the relocation period. A lot of them didn't like to talk about troubled times. Neither did I. But 40 years after President Roosevelt signed those executive orders, the U.S. Congress admitted that the incarceration of Japanese Americans was a result of wartime hysteria, racial prejudice, and a failure in political leadership. There was a law passed by George H.W. Bush that began the process of paying back reparations to Japanese American relocatees and their heirs. It began before I passed away and didn't conclude until after I died. Those families were given $20,000. Not all 120,000 Japanese Americans received that money, but about 82,000 did, and it cost the U.S. government $1.6 billion. Though I didn't live in Manzanar, the most famous internment camp during World War II, there's a plaque there that's erected, and there's a quote on there that means a lot to me. And it reads, "May the injustices and humiliations suffered here as a result of hysteria, racism, and economic exploitation never emerge again." And I hope we remember these words today. I'd like to thank you for listening to my story and the story of thousands of Japanese Americans.
Amen.